Hello and welcome to Hot Topic. I'm Hugh Riches. I'm joined by two Conservative candidates for the Yorkshire and Humber constituency of the European Parliament, both hoping to be spending more time abroad after the elections on the 22nd of May. They are Caroline Abbott and Michael Norton, both of whom welcome. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
First of all, you're standing for the European Parliament and you're coming from a party that is not necessarily dedicated to the idea of being within Europe. What can you do to further Conservative philosophy, policy in the European Parliament? Caroline.
We do an awful lot already. In fact, in this region, our MPs work very, very hard. For example, we've been in Hull this morning, where the Conservatives fought hard to make sure we got rid of the banning of discards, which was throwing back healthy live fish into the sea, which was a complete waste for the fishermen and for the fish stock itself. And that's because MPs turned up time and again to try and make sure that we made progress on this particular piece of legislation.
And that's something you. Have you got another example of something that the Conservative group in the European Parliament can do, Michael?
Well, they cover a whole gamut of issues, but since we are on the whole estuary, I think it's the best example. Fish discards was a major problem for the last 20 years. In fact, fishermen were obliged to throw healthy fish that were perfectly edible back into the North Sea because of misguided European policy. But it was Conservative MEPs who changed this law and have brought positive change to the region. And we're immensely proud of that.
Is it that the other parties did want to continue discarding healthy fish? Does this distinguish you from other parties in any way?
It's more a question of what do we think is the sensible approach. Labour were, unfortunately, a little less active. The Liberals were a little bit better. But this was a clear Conservative victory, which is why we're mentioning it.
More importantly, one of the MEPs who was actually on the committee for this particular issue was Nigel Farage, and he only turned up to 2 of 40 meetings over 5 years to defend British interests. So in terms of...
We'll come on to Nigel Farage.
No, that's fine, but it was, opportunity to get that one in. That is a clear example of the Conservatives take Europe seriously, the job seriously. You've worked in Brussels and you know how hard the MEPs in this region work, and, as we would do too.
Well, I was going to get on with the European Parliament itself. The Conservative policy domestically is, if re-elected in the House of Commons, that there'll be a renegotiation of Britain's role within Europe. And that part of that will be reform of the European institutions. The European Parliament is impotent. The law is made by...
Oh, far from it. It's anything but impotent.
Laws are made by the Commission as directives. The European Parliament has a supervisory role, a role over the budget and a role in appointing the President of the Union. What is it that the Parliament, and this is for all of Europe to decide, what is it that the Parliament could do if it were reformed? How would you change it?
Can I take this, Caroline?
Yeah.
Right, Hugh, I'm going to pick you up on that, actually. I completely disagree with your reading. The Commission does not make laws. It's a common misconception, but the Commission proposes laws, and then these are amended by the Council of Ministers of the European Union, which is our national governments, and the European Parliament. Now, previously, the Council had all of the power, and the European Parliament, as you say, was sort of like the House of Lords. It had a checking role, a balancing role, but it wasn't quite the equivalent. Since the Lisbon Treaty in December 2009, this has changed. The Council of Ministers, our national government, and the European Parliament are on the exact same footing. So in the areas where the European Union has competence, has the power to act, to implement new laws, the Parliament and the Council are exactly the same. But so it's very important to have good British MEPs in there.
Can the Parliament veto the Council?
Yes.
Can the Parliament veto the Commission?
Yes.
Well, actually, some examples. I mean, we've had a few examples over since David Cameron has been a Prime Minister. That, for starters, we've got out the bailout fund that the Labour got us into several years ago. We've also had the first historic budget cut in the total EU budget, which
initiated by the Parliament.
But no, by David Cameron. Everyone said it wouldn't be done. It couldn't be done. It's historic. It's 8 billion, which is maybe not a lot in the total budget, but 8 billion is a good start. We've also had other reforms that we've actually done. So we're actually already showing that we can do a little bit, but it's having the will and the majority.
But the Parliament votes on that. The Parliament votes on the budget. So the achievement that David Cameron got in the first place was subject to the Parliament's approval.
Well, in that case, there's an increase because of the Lisbon Treaty. That relationship becomes more like a lower house of an assembly being the representative European Parliament, directly elected by the people, and then sort of a Senate being the Council of Ministers, represented where each country, each nation state sends a representative, rather like a sort of pre-1913, or was it 13th Amendment United States legislature. So if that increases the power of the Parliament because it dilutes the democratic deficit, as it was known, that increases the democratic authority of the European Union. How does that sit with Conservative voters who might not necessarily want a greater authority in Europe?
Actually, the David Cameron and the Conservative position is actually that we want to be part of a dynamic, flexible Europe, back to what it was when people voted in the 75 referendum. We've moved a long way from that. So the renegotiations are actually on those lines, that we want to see a single market completed, which it isn't, and get back to what Europe was meant to be. So that's the lines of renegotiation that David Cameron's going to try and put forward, but then he's going to let the electorate decide.
But if it's simply going to be a European economic community, as it was before, if it's going to be a Zollern, as it were, a customs union, does it need a political institution like a parliament?
Well, the division of resources between European member states is a fundamentally political decision. Who wins and who loses, this is the essence of politics. So there has to be some political element. Now, whether that sits with the national governments in the Council of Ministers or through democratically elected MEPs is debatable. But one thing that David Cameron is doing, and I'm certain he will achieve, is demonstrating that power can flow to the European Union and back from it as well. Just as in our own country, we've had devolution, we've had centralisation of power in Westminster, and then devolution of power to the regional assemblies, to subnational jurisdictions. It will be wonderful when we see that power can come back from Brussels to the member state as well.
Well, that rather neatly leads on to something. You're both standing for an organisation known as the Conservative and Unionist Party, and Scotland on the 14th of September might choose no longer to be united. Is there not a similarity between the Scottish wish to be free of the supranational government of Westminster over several nations, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland? Is that not absolutely parallel and thus understandable to Conservatives who wish to be repatriating powers from another supranational organisation, the European Union?
Well, I think originally the original concept of the EU in post-war was to remove the sinews of war, and it was more appropriate, I suppose, because of geographical location that they formed that group. It took us a long time to get into the EU. We were rejected in the first couple of occasions. I think we have been a little bit removed because there's a big bit of a sea between us. I personally really hope that Scotland stay with us, because I think we're stronger as a union in one country than we would be apart. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's, you know, as we've said to the electorate, the British voters, it's up to you to decide on the referendum in out of Europe. You know, it's up to the Scottish people to decide whether they want to be part of us. We're going to campaign to try and keep them, you know, part of the union. But at the end of the day, it is democratically, it's their vote.
But the Conservative Party is fundamentally democratic. It should be up to the Scottish people to decide if they want to remain as part of the United Kingdom, and it should be for all British people to decide if they want the United Kingdom to stay part of the EU. But democracy is the essence of our party.
But by the same logic, it should be for the people of Yorkshire and Humber to decide if they wish to be a sovereign state of their own right, if democratically they wish to be, or perhaps just the people of Cleethorpes. They'd like to be the Republic of Cleethorpes.
Well,
by that logic.
As a party, that we are very, we've always had the localism. Localism has been put on the statute books already, but we've always been about localism. So we always try and get parish councils and, you know, power from bottom up rather than top down. That's the difference between us and Labour. So we you know, we pride ourselves in that local democracy and local choices and local decision making.
You mentioned the origins of the European Union there after the Second World War. Well, its main purpose, and one that's been quite successful in so far, is preventing Germany and France from going to war every generation. The eastern borders of Europe are dangerous and hot at the moment. There's a tension from Russia and the Baltic states. I know that NATO and the EU are very often coterminous, with completely different purposes. The EU does need to have a united foreign policy, does it not?
No, it certainly does not. Foreign policy gets to the essence again of democracy. Do we go to war or do we not? Now, if we think back 10 years ago to 2003, there were some countries in Europe, Britain amongst them, Poland amongst them, Spain and Portugal, who thought that Saddam Hussein was the threat and wanted to put their own troops in harm's way. Germany and France did not. Now, neither choice was necessarily better than the other.
I must stop you there, Michael. It's very sorry. We must take a break there. Please return in a moment when we'll have more from the Tories in Europe. Welcome back. I'm with Conservative European parliamentary candidates for Yorkshire and Humber, Michael Norton and Carolyn Abbott. Before we broke there, we were talking about foreign policy. I want to talk a little bit about domestic party matters here. Your greatest threat as Conservative candidates for the European Union in this election is UKIP, is it not?
Well, yes, it's fair to say that, that they've actually trampled on some of our usually Eurosceptic notions. But at the end of the day, the Conservative Party is the only party that can actually make real change. We know Labour and Lib Democrats, they don't see any need for any change in Europe whatsoever. They won't give the British public a say in a referendum. UKIP want to give people to come out of the EU, but they actually have no power to deliver that. They can't make any changes. That one single MP in Westminster, they can't make any changes, whether they had every MEP selected at 22nd of May or not. So we have to really get our message across. It's a really important election this time. The first Euro election in a generation where people under 58 have actually got a chance to have their say. And we're the only people who actually can make a difference and a change.
But why is it that so many people who would usually vote Conservative, vote Tory in any sort of election, are tempted now to vote UKIP? Because there is the Tory party, while it would reform the European Union, doesn't wish to withdraw from the European Union. So why is it people who share Tory values in all sorts of other ways, why is it that they're tempted to a kind of pseudo quasi-Tory party with this nationalistic agenda, Michael?
Well, Hugh, when you look at the people who are tempted to vote UKIP, people often say that they're Conservative voters, but actually when you ask them, when you do a poll, who did you previously vote for, you'll find that UKIP take as much support from the Labour Party, even the Liberal Democrats on occasion, as they do from us. Now, on the wider scale of why people vote UKIP, I think it's less a question about the European Union and European policy per se, and more perception of politics. I'm from Yorkshire, as is Carolyn, we're both local people, but there seems to be, when we knock on the doorstep, a perception that politics has become professionalised, that it's Westminster Village, a little collection of MPs and their assistants and lobbyists who all talk to each other and have forgotten what real life is actually like. And UKIP, for its many faults, is not at all professional.
It's not, no.
It is. Nigel Farage seems like a man in the pub.
It is. It's a protest vote. And, you know, UKIP, like the Lib Dems before them in the last election, had the advantages of being the remoteness of government, where they can say what they like to curry favour, because actually at the end of the day, they won't be called to question on this. And when Lib Dem came into coalition power and all of a sudden they had to let down students and other people they'd promised things to, you know, the reality hits in. There's lots of things that the Conservative Party are having to do that we wouldn't want to do, but we have to do in terms of the economy and the economy. You know, that's the way it is.
Are you suggesting that the white working class, which is the battleground for Labour, Conservative and UKIP, that those floating voters, they don't want professional politicians. They don't want professionalism in their politicians. They want a bloke with a pint in his hand and a fag between his fingers more than somebody who is used to reading policy documents and understanding the nature of legislation.
I think they want people who seem authentic. Now, Winston Churchill was anything but a man of the people. He was a very, very rich, he was a scion of the aristocracy, always with a cigar in the middle of war, but the people loved him.
He had rich family, but he had to earn his pennies by writing. But yeah, sorry, go on.
By writing, well, anyway. But UKIP, they do seem authentic. Now, the Conservative Party has responded to this by selecting local candidates, by selecting normal people who share normal local values to fight for them.
But that's what they've always done. Presumably all the parties have done that.
Well, I think far from it. If you look at the movement that began under Tony Blair especially, where we did see the beginnings of Westminster Village, then we did move to a more Americanised professional system of politics, and now, for better or worse, and I think much for the better, politics is coming back the other way.
Well, I think we saw the beginnings of the Westminster Village with the founders of your party in the Tamworth Manifesto in the 1830s and Robert Peel. That was the professionalisation of politics, the creation of the Westminster Village, the invention of machine politics in this country. I'm not suggesting that's a bad thing. I'm suggesting that wanting amateurism, just because it's, as you say, authentic,
it is actually,
doesn't mean anything.
It's a protest. It's frustration. I think for too long now, immigration keeps coming up on the doorstep. Issues about the interference in daily lives with European policy and other issues. And I think it's a frustration that people say, you know what, we've given mainstream parties enough time to sort this out. It seems to be going a bit too slowly. And it's just like this to give a kick up the backside, really, is that we're going to not vote for any of the above.
But UKIP is not a mass movement by any means. UKIP is one charismatic man. I'll ask you now, and your viewers at home, we all know Mr Farage, but who is UKIP's number 2? Who is the number 3? Who is the number 4? If we vote UKIP, who are we actually getting beyond Mr Farage?
Yes, but if we went down to the doorsteps and we asked who's the number 2, the number 3, the number 5, the number 7 in the Conservative Party or the coalition cabinet,
I think most people would know George Osborne. I think they would know William Hague. I think they would know Mr Gove. I think they would know a large number of Conservative figures. And the same on the Labour benches as well.
I hope you find they know a few more names than that on the doorstep as well, but I do wish you luck with that. Just to go back to the point about one of the UKIP's great campaigning points, 70%, they say, of our laws are made in Europe. Is this true?
No, and Mr Farage admitted as such. He said very recently, this is a number that we made up. It's not true. It's completely false.
What sort of percentage of the laws that we must obey are made in Europe?
It depends how close we define it. Strictly speaking, the European Union has two legislative instruments: regulations, which are directly applicable, and they account for about 7% of our laws, and directives, and these set general goals to be achieved, and they leave the means to be defined by the member states. Now, when we go from a general principle like reduce climate change, and then our national government says, right, to reduce our carbon emissions, we'll do X, Y, and Z, is that a European law or British law? I think sensibly, European countries come together and define very sensible goals, and member states decide how they will go about achieving those goals.
But there's a degree to which, Carolyn, as well as climate change, that's obviously an international matter, there are perfectly laws that can under no circumstances be controversial. For instance, the use of using one set of weights and measures. It's obviously easier to trade. It's a fundamental of the development of
well, it's sensible
medieval
for an engineer
industry.
to deal in specific measurements as opposed to pounds and ounces, but why shouldn't you have a choice to if I want to go and buy a pound of apples, why should we stop by some bureaucrat in Brussels to buy a pound of apples? I think that's, but no one should really stop anybody buying a pound of apples, but, as an engineer and somebody who's in, precise measurements, it wouldn't be much use,
But
probably.
if you're a food manufacturer at one end of Europe and you're a dairy farmer at the other end of Europe, and you say, I want to buy 200 tons of milk to make cheese, you want to know that you're both talking about the same measurement.
And I think when it comes to dealing, I think the sensible, at the end of the day, if we forget that it's not the European Union and governments that make deals in business, it's business people.
It's businesses themselves. We'll be very
And they're
clear.
sensible,
Yes,
yeah.
but one of the
They won't get
purposes,
it right,
one of the
wrong.
fundamental purposes of any government at any level is to provide that consistency of weights and measures. Surely,
I think it's just the way that particular issue was brought. Nobody likes to be told what to do, and I think people who are actually dealing in big weights and measures will deal in the appropriate weights and measures with the people they're dealing with, and it shouldn't have affected. It shouldn't have meant people being fined in a fruit and veg shop for selling pounds.
Selling sugar by the pound.
Yeah.
I'll just ask about some of your colleagues in the European Parliament who you hope to join. In 2009, the Conservative group in the European Parliament moved from the European People's Group to the European Conservatives and Reformists group. Now that's moving. That was a shift to all the countries, the domestic parties, have their members of the European Parliament join international ideologically defined groups in the European Parliament. Your new group, the European Conservatives and Reformists, you've got some funny bedfellows there. You're in there with the Latvian Legion, with Robert Ziller, who occasionally commemorates the activities of the Waffen-SS in his country, and Mikan Kaminski, who has said all sorts of things about minorities from Poland. Are you comfortable with these people?
I think if you look at all the groups in the European Parliament, you're dealing with 750 MEPs from across the continent. There will always be people with views that are quite different to our own. But if you look at the European People's Party, there are Italian MEPs, for example, who were members of Lega Nord, very nasty racists. If you look at the left-wing groups, you see people who are socialists now, who 20 years ago or 30 years ago were part of the German security services in East Germany. We are not responsible for people in other countries. We can only put forward our own views to the people of Yorkshire and explain what we are standing for.
Well, I used to do a lot of work in the former Soviet Union. Some of my best friends are former KGB officers, but that's not something that I'd make a generalisation about. How about you, Carolyn? You'd be happy to work with these people?
Well, the reason why we set this group up is because we weren't very comfortable. We couldn't stay in the group that we were in because it wasn't actually. It was moving more to a closer union, and really there's a common denominator in our new group, and that's because we want to be in a more flexible, less closer union. That's I don't know these people individually. I'm no doubt if we get there, we'll get to meet them.
You'll both have to forgive me. I'll have to stop you there. I'm terribly sorry to be so rude. That's all we have time for this time, I regret. Tune into the next hot topic for Godfrey Bloom MEP, late of UKIP, and some more advocation of their policy. See you then. Bye.